Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Dirks, and on behalf of ACRL and Choice, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Sexology, the Challenge of Anonymity and Striking the Balance Between Subject Privacy and Scholarly Practice, which is sponsored by Adam Matthew. Today's discussion is one in a series of sponsored webinars from ACRL and Choice that addresses new ideas, developments, and products of interest to the academic library community. Reda users, these structured 60-minute live presentations provide the opportunity for interactive discussions of important new issues and developments in academic librarianship by librarians, vendors, authors, and other interested stakeholders. Before we get started, I would just like to point out a few features of the webinar software. In the main area of the screen, you should be able to follow along with the presentation materials. Along the right-hand side, you may see a Q&A panel and a chat panel. If you don't see the chat panel, you can move your mouse over your screen, and it should pull up some buttons along the bottom there. The one third from the right rather, is the chat button, and that will open and close the chat box for you. Please use the Q&A box to send questions to our speakers. We'll save some time at the end to answer any questions that you have, or as many as we have time to get to. So please do send in your questions throughout. And if you're having trouble with sound or seeing things or any other sort of technical difficulty, please use the chat to message me directly, and we'll troubleshoot that issue privately. All right. Today, we are using the hashtag ACRL Choice Webinars. So if you've got another screen handy, shout out to us. We're at choice_reviews on Twitter. Also note that we are recording today's program, and everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with a link to the archived version. All right. So our presentation today includes presentations from Paul Deslandes, Rebecca Lind from Adam Matthew, Shawn Wilson, who, as we've heard, was the Associate Director of Collections at the Kinsey Institute, and Liana Zhou, who is the Director at the Kinsey Institute Library and Special Collections. So here to kick things off for us is Rebecca Lind.
Hello everyone, and thank you Mark for that introduction. This webinar has been designed to reflect the challenges of privacy and anonymity when working with primary source material, both within the archive and in digital resources, such as Adam Matthews' forthcoming Sex and Sexuality collection. Before we delve into the main discussion, however, I'd like to quickly introduce myself, if I may. I am a production editor at Adam Matthew and have had the great pleasure of acting as the editorial project lead for Sex and Sexuality. I have been with the company for just shy of 5 years now, and during that time I've worked on an array of diverse and interesting collections such as Colonial America, Migration to New Worlds, Frontier Life, and Gender, Identity and Social Change. Now I feel my fellow speakers really need no introduction, but today I am joined by Liana Zhou, Director of the Kinsey Institute Library and Special Collections, Shawn Wilson, Associate Director from the Kinsey Institute also, and Professor Paul Deslandes, who's Chair and Associate Professor of History at the University of Vermont, all of whom have been working closely with myself and closely involved and integral really to the collection Sex and Sexuality. I would also like to give a brief introduction to Adam Matthews for any listeners who are not already familiar with us. We are a publisher of digital primary source collections for the humanities and social sciences. We are based in the UK, but we do work with archives, libraries and museums all over the world, digitising rare primary source content for scholarly research and teaching. And essential to this work is the partnerships we build with leading international archives such as the Kinsey Institute. As already mentioned, the main discussion of today's webinar will revolve around material included in Adam Matthews' forthcoming Sex and Sexuality resource. This unique collaboration with the Kinsey Institute Library and Special Collections will provide access to a wealth of essential primary sources collated by prominent sex researchers and sexologists, including the first 3 institute directors, Dr. Alfred Kinsey, Dr. Paul Gebhard, and Dr. June Reinisch. The breadth and complexity of human sexual understanding and experience is laid bare in much of the content, and the resource really provides a rich ground for exploring changing attitudes towards human sexuality, gender identities, and sexual behaviours throughout the 20th century. Comprised of correspondence shared between professional and private individuals, autobiographical accounts, personal data, official reports, and administrative and conference papers, we have had to carefully consider and approach the significant proportion of personal data present in this material. Needless to say, the subject around which today's webinar is framed has been a key focus of the resource, a focus that Paul chose to highlight in a fantastic essay he contributed to the resource entitled Using Anonymous Sources in Writing About the History and Experience of Sexuality in the 20th Century. I will be discussing in more detail a little later on the various ways in which Adam Matthew and the Kinsey Institute have together worked to protect subject privacy within the digital resource. But first, I've selected a few document excerpts here, which should be appearing on the slideshow now, that I feel really demonstrate that concerns around anonymity and confidentiality in this field are by no means a modern phenomenon. These documents from 1968 and 1979 respectively both addressed Dr. Paul Gebhard, the second director of the then-known Institute for Sex Research, show clear anxiety and caution around the collection of personal data for studies of sexual behaviour. The need for assurance for anonymity is listed as one of the main methodological problems for researchers in the first letter, for instance. We can see similar misgivings in the second, this time from a subject's perspective. This letter, written by an army officer wishing to contribute to research by submitting private marital letters, tapes, and correspondence created during service in Vietnam, echoes the same concern, stipulating unambiguously that his data may only be used for study if assurance that any use of it in research would remain anonymous can be given. I would now like to hand over to Liana and Shawn, who are going to talk in some more detail about the Kinsey Institute Library and Special Collections and their commitment to upholding the highest standards of confidentiality and privacy for donors and individuals represented within their archival collections.
Thank you, Rebecca. Hi, everyone. My name is Liana Zhou, and I'm very pleased to be part of the panel discussion today. The Kinsey Institute is part of Indiana University, and we are located in Bloomington, Indiana. Our web address is www.kinseyinstitute.org. I would like to share the origin stories of the Kinsey Institute library collections, and also focus on a bit about Kinsey and his research team's effort in balancing anonymity while giving voice to their subjects. The Kinsey Institute was named as the Institute for Sex Research back in 1947. The name change from the Institute for Sex Research to Kinsey was done in 1980s to honor our founder, Dr. Kinsey. Kinsey also founded the Kinsey Research Library. On the screen is Dr. Kinsey being featured on the Time magazine cover in August 1953. Kinsey discovered a gap in our knowledge about sexuality, and this discovery compelled him to take on an unprecedented large-scale research. His research team interviewed more than 18,000 individuals, and their discovery of human sexuality was published in 2 milestone publications: Sexual Behavior in the Human Male in 1948, and Sexual Behavior in the Human Female in 1953. Scholars have described the Kinsey collection as a living monument for Dr. Kinsey, and our collection documents the progress of sex research, as well as individual cultural expressions of human sexuality. Our collection is expansive and growing. Tens of thousands of scholars and donors have contributed to the growth of our collections, and we thank them. Our mission is to advance sexual health and knowledge worldwide. Confidentiality and privacy is a cornerstone for Kinsey research. To anonymize their sources, the team researchers codified more than 18,000 case histories. Here's a sample of Dr. Kinsey's interview code sheet. One single code sheet was sufficient to record most histories. Kinsey's subjects were assured of their confidentiality. Otherwise, the subjects would not have provided their life experiences freely, openly, and honestly. Many sexual behaviors would be considered as illegal, immoral, or not acceptable by the society in 1940s and 50s. So Kinsey Library and Adam Matthews partnership is built on the mutual agreement on the importance of privacy and confidentiality. And this is one topic that we discussed extensively throughout the collaboration. Without it, we don't think the partnership would have taken place. So we thank Adam Matthews for their diligence and effort in protecting the confidentiality and privacy of the records. And I'm now pleased to turn over to my colleague, Shawn Wilson, who will be talking about the scholars' access, policy, and practices at the Kinsey Institute Library. Thank you.
Thanks, Liana. I will talk about a little bit about our patrons, projects they're working on, and some of the policies that we follow. Keep in line with confidentiality. Our users include local IU students and faculty, but also students, faculty, and independent scholars from across the country and the world. They're working on class assignments, dissertations, articles, books, documentaries, and exhibitions. John Money Collection, which will be featured in Sex and Sexuality, has been used extensively, especially in recent years, given the upward trend in conversations around transgender and intersex topics. Other research using collections included in Sex and Sexuality are Sexuality and Aging, History of Scientific Authority, Kinsey's correspondence with the general public, Adolescent Sexuality, Transgender Medicine and Healthcare, and Gender Identity. Prior to use of the collections, our users are asked to provide a project description. We use this information to verify what they're working on and to match up materials that may be essential for their research. Because the original documents are not redacted, we do ask all users to read and sign our registration and confidentiality form. The form states any donor information must remain confidential. Other areas of confidentiality include names, addresses, dates of birth, or any identifying information or information that could lead to the identity of a subject. The intent, of course, is to focus on the content of the material. The form also states that users must apply for permission to photograph, duplicate, or reproduce in any way any materials in publications, presentations, documentaries, or exhibitions. Through that permission process, we're able to see exactly how the material will be used and to make sure confidential information is being treated as such. We do also promise to keep confidential each user's project and what materials they have used. Obviously, researchers may want to collaborate, but we do seek out permission on both sides before sharing any information. Information about access policies, registration, and confidentiality form is available on the collections page, which you can see on the screen. Our library email, is also available. If you have any further questions, feel free to contact us. Thank you.
Thanks, Shawn. So I just wanted to talk a little bit here about the stringent and consistent redaction process applied across the digital sex and sexuality resource. Multi-level redaction policy has been applied throughout to account for the varying formats in which personal data appears in the material. On the current slide, you will see an example of a document which has undergone redaction applied to protect the author. You will see 4 areas circled. This indicates elements identified as sensitive in this instance and therefore redacted in some way. So, starting from the top, you will see that the image directory in the URL is circled. Within the archive, many of the correspondence collections have been preserved with the file names and titles with which they were originally organized by the sex researchers and directors of the Kinsey Institute. Often, these are simply recorded as the names of subjects or organizations corresponding with researchers and directors at the Institute. In this digital resource, however, together with the Kinsey Institute, we have been able to protect these subjects further by replacing the original full name file directories with generic numeric references so as to eliminate any kind of identification. The second circle, just beneath, is drawn around where the subject's address featured in the original letter. This has been redacted again to protect subject privacy. The third circle is drawn around the subject's name or signature, again for the same reason. The fourth circle at the very bottom of the slide highlights that the name of the item within the resource has also been changed to protect subject privacy. The titles of items within the archive generally match the image directories exactly across the correspondence collections at least, displaying the name of the relevant subject or organization. In agreement with the Kinsey Institute, we have adapted titles so as to give a description of the item's content instead. Not only does this further protect subjects, but descriptive titles are anticipated to further enable more efficient and robust research. Now, these are the most common areas where redaction has been applied across all material. But that said, identifying data does come in a variety of forms, and we anticipated that. So every single image that is included within the collection has been reviewed, and individual redaction has been carried out to capture and redact any other kind of identifying information, such as, but not limited to, social security numbers, family names, birth dates, call to educational records, and even military IDs. So I think that leads me on quite nicely now to introduce Paul, who will be talking in more depth about the importance of this kind of redaction in modern research and how redacted sources need not hinder it.
Great. Thanks very much, Rebecca. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone today. My name is Paul Deslandes. I am a historian, actually, of modern Britain, although I work on some transatlantic issues as well in my research. What I'd like to do for the time that I have is to speak a little bit about my role as a historian and the ways in which I have used sources that have either already been anonymized for me or require that I anonymize them as a historian. So I want to talk a little bit about that process and the ways in which one works with those particular kinds of restrictions. And also, as Rebecca rightly notes, to think about anonymity as not necessarily a hindrance. In addition to doing that, I'd also like to talk a bit about the essay that Rebecca has referenced and discuss with you the ways in which I have kind of conceptualized this topic. And what I'd like to do is talk broadly about the issue of anonymity and privacy in both the academic setting and in sort of the contemporary cultural and political context, and then talk with you in greater depth about the ways in which one might use anonymized sources to get at issues of personal information, personal identities, and the nature of historical experiences. So in doing that, I will raise some general points and then delve into, in greater depth with you, two letters from the collection that I spent some time with and reflected upon as I was considering this whole question of anonymity. They are both letters written to Dr. Kinsey, one from 1945 and one from 1953. The one from 1953 was written by a woman, and the one from 1945 was written by a man. So I want to talk with you a bit about what those letters reveal and how we can use them to consider issues in the history of sexuality. So let me turn first to my role as a historian and the ways in which I have encountered the use of anonymized sources in my own research. As I mentioned before, I am a historian of modern Britain, and my particular focus is on the history of gender and sexuality, which is one area where historians are frequently encountering anonymized sources and having to deal with issues of confidentiality and privacy. I have just recently completed a book called The Culture of Male Beauty in Britain, from the first photographs to David Beckham. And on the surface, that would not necessarily appear to be a book in which anonymity figures very prominently. But in fact, it is a book that deals with questions of anonymized sources, primarily because I've used two collections that require the preservation of anonymity, one of which has actually been digitized by Adam Matthew, and that is the Mass Observation Archive, which is located physically at the University of Sussex, but I've used both the online version and the actual records themselves in Sussex. Mass Observation, for those of you who don't know, was a project begun in the 1930s in Britain that was intended to reconstruct a kind of anthropology of ourselves, as they said at that point in time. And the project involved a variety of different things, including the requests that individuals would write longer narrative diaries of their experiences, including their experiences during the Second World War, but also respond to a series of directives in which Mass Observation asked a variety of different questions about various aspects of life in the 1930s, 1940s, and early 1950s. I should mention that while the project in its original form ends in the 1950s, it gets resurrected in the 1980s and continues to this day in some form. Now, in those directives, people would respond to questions about a range of issues, and they really ran the gamut. So some of those dealt explicitly with matters like the issues around the monarchy, around coronation, around responses to cinemas and cinema going, around pub going, around a range of issues. Because of the nature of my topic, I was especially interested in the material in the collection that relates to personal grooming, attitudes to the body, etc. And in looking at that material, the anonymity was actually done for me, or the anonymizing was done for me. People were assigned a number in this particular instance, and they responded with that number, but also with identifying information, often about their social background and the geographical region, usually in Britain, where they were from. So that's one kind of anonymous source that I've used, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about the issues that I've encountered in using those. The other is a survey, much like well, not entirely like, but similar in some ways to some of the work that the Kinsey Institute was doing. And this was a survey conducted in Great Britain in the 1980s called the National Lesbian and Gay Survey. It began in the 1980s and actually continues until the early 2000s. In this instance, a very similar format was followed, where people were asked to comment on issues ranging from body image and pornography to things like the death of Princess Diana in 1997. So there was actually a remarkable range of responses. And again, the sources have been anonymized, with individual respondents provided with a number and some identifying information about who they were as individuals, usually occupation, geographical location, etc. Now, in those instances, while there were certain hindrances that occurred to me, most notably not being able to pursue in great depth and down a particular track the lives and the life stories of the individuals who were responding. But I also noted that there were rich opportunities in having source material where individuals had the ability to remain anonymous and to speak openly and honestly about the issues that they were being asked to comment on. So I saw both opportunities and hindrances in that, and I want to sort of reflect on those themes as I talk with you in greater depth about the issue of anonymity and the issue of privacy, and then how that relates especially to the materials that have been digitized by Adam Matthew from the Kinsey Institute. In the essay that I have written about these matters, I spent a considerable amount of time reflecting on what it means to have a lack of an attribution in a document in the sense of authorial attribution, and whether that renders a document useless, which I think especially in regard to my teaching, students find anonymous sources sometimes frustrating because they'd like to know the identity of the individual, particularly when you're talking about matters of sexuality. For many of them, they feel that this is a way for them to gain kind of greater access and have a closer affinity with the subject. But the issues that I grappled with in the essay and that I reflected on sort of took on two different forms. One was to sort of think more in the abstract about the nature of privacy and anonymity, and talk about the ways in which that has influenced American culture in particular, but because I'm a British historian, I was also thinking about the context in the United Kingdom as well. So I talked about that in the first part of the essay. In the second part of the essay, I talk in greater depth about the actual sources themselves. So let me just say very briefly that this whole question of privacy and anonymity is one that enters into nearly every facet of contemporary life. And as I reflected on this, I noted several areas where matters of anonymity and privacy were especially important. Privacy, especially in the case of medical records and the degree to which medical practitioners are in some ways bound by the ancient Hippocratic oath that requires them to retain or maintain the privacy of their patients. And then I was also reminded of something that very much has an impact on my life as a university professor and administrator, and that is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, otherwise known as FERPA, that was first passed in 1974. This is the act, of course, that requires all of us to maintain the confidentiality of our students and to ensure that we don't share vital information and vital records without their permission. I noted in reflecting on these issues that we also talk a lot about anonymity in the context of journalistic writing, in particular thinking about the ways in which journalists rely increasingly on anonymous sources. And of course, in the United States at the current moment, we are thinking very carefully about privacy and anonymity in relation to the current impeachment proceedings that are occurring, most notably the idea of preserving the anonymity of the so-called whistleblower. Anonymity is also an important issue in the various areas of the social sciences, so that anthropologists, sociologists, cultural geographers, etc., are all constantly thinking about the importance of preserving the anonymity of their sources or their informants, and talk in often quite interesting and compelling terms about the need to create safe spaces where their informants can choose to be honest and open about their life experiences. As I researched this essay and as I thought a bit about the issues that were raised in this essay, and I'm terribly sorry that my phone just went off, as we explored those issues, or as I reflected on those issues in researching this essay, I noted that many social scientists actually have have engaged in a kind of debate around questions of anonymity, and in particular thinking about balancing between the creation of safe spaces and the preservation of anonymity, and the need to provide a space where people can go on the record and can have their views and their viewpoints expressed openly and actually revealed. And it was interesting to read some of the writing that people have produced around these matters, because this is a very crucial and important issue in both academic life and, as I said, contemporary culture. I should say, as a historian, I was also paying a lot of attention to the area that I have known most about as a historian, and that is both the history of sexuality and the history of mental health. Those people who have explored the history of mental health have talked about the need to preserve anonymity and maintain confidentiality in the medical records that they explore. But again, an issue around the tensions that might exist between privacy and the need to maintain privacy and the need to preserve anonymity, and the desire to perhaps allow people who have suffered from mental illness to actually speak as historical subjects so that they are not further silenced in the way that they perhaps have been in the past. So what I discovered in reflecting on all of this and in thinking about these topics was that this was an enormously interesting intellectual area that was fraught with a range of interesting debates, reflections, and discussions about methodology. And for the remainder of my time, what I'd really like to do is talk with you in greater depth about the kinds of source material that are available to historians in the materials or the collection that has been digitized. And what I focused on in particular were letters, as I mentioned, to Dr. Kinsey, although the letters to Paul Gebhardt are also fascinating historical documents. And the way I've treated these and the way I've thought about them in researching and writing about them is to sort of think about them as personal narratives, drawing very heavily on some of the writing and work of a historian named Penny Summerfield in the United Kingdom. In exploring the letters and the materials that were sent to Kinsey, I focused primarily on queries to Kinsey about his research, on the provision of what we might think of as life histories, and on reflections and questions of reflections on and questions about what individual letter writers often referred to as sexual problems. So those three areas: queries, life histories, and reflections on and questions about sexual problems. What I discovered in thinking about these letters is that enormous amounts of information are revealed in their content. And what I discussed in the essay and what I have really thought carefully about as a historian are really three areas. Firstly, the ways in which historians might read anonymized sources for personal information and for social context. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that as I discuss with you the two examples I've chosen for today. You can learn an awful lot without someone's name about class position, about race, about education, about religion, about marital status, about sexual attitudes, etc. You can gain a tremendous amount of insight by reading closely and carefully. For example, one of the letters, which I won't talk about now, but which I did actually look at and discuss in the essay, relates to how one situates a particular subject who discusses his access to issues or access to information about sexuality, but also reveals a tremendous amount about his locale, where he's from. He talks about speaking Turkish. He talks about his travels in Europe. So we learn quite a bit about his educational and social background in thinking about the source. The second area that I think one can glean from sources that have been anonymized, and I think is a really important area, is to sort of think or to consider personal identities and experiences, the ways in which individuals attempt to situate themselves. We can learn an awful lot about an individual letter writer by thinking about these issues without having access to what that individual's name was. So for example, we can understand how people think about the categories of sexual identity that existed in the middle part of the 20th century, identifying themselves either as heterosexual or homosexual, and the degree to which those ideas permeate the letter writer's ideas and thoughts. We can reflect on, by thinking about personal identities and thinking about this in relation to anonymous sources, we can think about and reflect on psychological theories and the way in which psychological theories and psychological ideas permeate mid-20th century American culture. The last area that I think is especially important and crucial for us to remember is that in thinking about anonymous sources, not only should we consider matters of personal information and context or personal identities and experiences, but we also need to think very seriously about what literary scholars and others have referred to as sort of styles of self-narration. And I think the way in which people choose to present themselves and tell stories about their personal experiences are vitally important. So I paid very close attention in reflecting on what we can learn from anonymous sources. I paid close attention to turns of phrase, to metaphors, etc., to the ways in which, for example, people talk about certain sexual activities or sexual identities as quote unquote social problems or even pathologies. So let me turn the last few minutes to some letters that I have chosen from the collection. The first letter, written to Alfred Kinsey in 1953, is from a woman who is writing to really offer her opinion. And what she is especially interested in offering her opinion about are mid-20th century theories about female frigidity. And one of the things that she opens with, and I have been talking with my students this very week about Alfred Kinsey, and of course I teach on the history of sexuality, so I made some reference to these materials in that class. But she makes reference, as you can see from the letter, to a Reader's Digest article that started with an interesting phrase: "There are no frigid women, only stupid men." And this particular letter writer goes on then to provide a pretty intimate sexual history of her life. She notes that she's been married 4 times. She notes that until she met her 4th husband, she herself was frigid. As she says, "I was frigid until I married my 4th husband, who was the ideal lover," right? So she makes reference to the fact that he was an ideal lover. As she proceeds through the letter, she talks about having 10 years of married bliss. And on the second page of the letter, gives us a number of wonderful insights about her sexual life. Of course, I was deeply, and you can see that in the second paragraph, of course, I was deeply in love with my 4th, and I just melted when he touched me. I was in love with the others too, but not as much. But he exerted a special effort to work with me. A special effort to work me up to a passion. So we learn quite a lot here about her sexual life without her revealing specific acts from these statements. She then goes on, and this is quite important. In the last 2 paragraphs, she talks about the increasing divorce rate in American society and essentially says more women are getting divorced because they have more options. And in the last set paragraph, she's very clear about her own emerging feminism at a point in time where feminist ideas were really just in the second wave, were really just starting to circulate in any kind of great way in the middle part of the century. So in the last paragraph, there are still too many men that think a wife has to take anything from her husband and like it. Well, the women today have certainly proven that the men today cannot get away with it anymore, reflecting some of these feminist ideas. So if you think about this anonymous letter, we can learn an awful lot about the woman. We can learn that she was a regular reader of the Reader's Digest. We can learn that she was married 4 times. We can learn that she had a satisfying sexual relationship with her husband, especially her 4th husband, and that she's open to sexuality. We can learn that she is aware and conscious of the tremendous social changes that are occurring in the post-World War II era. And we can learn that she's also being influenced by some feminist thought. While we can't know for sure who she was influenced by, we can assume that work like that of Simone de Beauvoir, which was published in the late 1940s, may in fact be informing her perspective. Now, in the second letter, or the second case study that I want to refer to for just a minute or two more before I conclude, we have a young man writing to Alfred Kinsey, and we learn a great amount here about this young man. In the first paragraph, we learn that he and Kinsey, and this letter is from 1945, we learn that he and Kinsey have met before. We learn that he was a pre-medical student. We also learn that he has or possesses what he says is a rather unusual sexual story. And then he proceeds to talk about the love that he has felt for his college roommate, who at some point is sent off to war, presumably in the latter stages of the Second World War. And we learn all of that in the on the first page. What's especially interesting to me is his profession of love. If you look at the third paragraph, or the second full paragraph, excuse me, he goes on to say, ultimately, I went on being in love with him in approved movie style, except for the homosexual aspect. So he kind of reminds us of the ways in which popular culture inform understandings of human sexuality in this period. On the second page of the letter, he goes on to talk in great depth about what he sees as a kind of transitional moment. He lives with a man that he identifies as especially virile, and has his first sexual experience with a woman, but then proceeds to note that he continues to fantasize about men. On the third page, he discusses in great depth his masturbatory habits, which I think you get a tremendous amount of intimacy here in thinking about these sorts of documents, these sources. But he also talks about what he identifies as a transition in his sexuality, where he now transitions to arguing, in this instance, that he is fantasizing more about women. And then on the last page, he goes on to sort of ask questions of Dr. Kinsey, in which he says, is it possible for me to have a shift in sexual object choice, very much reflecting some of the Freudian ideas that are popular at this time. He also notes in this short second to last paragraph, you gather I am anxious to stay on the right side of society. So he reflects for us on the ways in which American society at this time may not, in fact, accept homosexual inclinations or homosexual behaviors. So within this letter, we learn a tremendous amount about his educational background, about his love life, about the ways in which he understands sexuality in the mid-20th century psychological moment. Alfred Kinsey responds to him in another letter, and while this may not be entirely clear, what he says here is he apologizes for the delay, indicates that he's interested in talking to him further, and then says that preferences in sex are like preferences in food, and notes that it is possible for a human being to have shifts and to have shifts in taste over the course of one's life, which I think is sort of an interesting indication of the way Kinsey tried to encourage people to not think in terms of normality and abnormality or perversion and normality, but rather to think in terms of preference and taste. Now, all of these letters, and there are many, many more in the collection that are worth examining, are remarkably revealing. And what I hope I've been able to sort of show for you are the ways in which the materials can be used actively and very effectively by historians and by students of history in thinking carefully about the history of sexuality, in this case, in the middle part of the 20th century. So I'll end there, and we'll hope for some questions. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Paul. That was wonderful. So at this stage in the webinar, we tend to move to a Q&A session. So for anybody listening, if you have any questions that have come to mind throughout the webinar, please submit those through the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. But one question that I'm really interested to hear from Liana and Paul and Shawn, your opinions on the question on the screen now. What does this mean for future research? A key question, I think. So yeah, what are your thoughts on this?
This is Paul here. I'm happy to weigh in first, if that's okay with everyone. But one thing that I was thinking about as a historian, particularly as a historian of gender and sexuality, and especially as someone who has written a lot recently on the period since the 1970s, is that as we continue to write new types of history and as we reflect more on the late 20th century, particularly using documents and materials for those people who are still alive, that we're going to have to continue to contend with the issue of anonymity, that some people in, for example, sharing their personal papers with historians might, in fact, only do so on the condition that they be allowed to remain anonymous, or they might only concede or express a willingness to participate in an oral history interview if their anonymity can be preserved. So I think as a historian, I consider the ways in which the shifts in the discipline toward reflecting a little bit more on the late 20th century necessitates that we engage with these questions around anonymity and privacy, and the anonymity and privacy of our subjects in particular. That's just one thought I have, but I'll let others talk.
Hi, this is Shawn. You're exactly right, Paul. We are still currently actively collecting and receive donations today. You know, a lot of these people have materials that they've received, collected themselves or received from family members. So obviously you have descendants who are still alive. That's one of the reasons we do ask for confidentiality of donor information, but then also within what's in the document.
I agree with Shawn and Paul on the analysis and the perspective. I think particularly the donors and the creators of content, what we know, their intention was always to make their story known while not being, their identity not being revealed. So I think this has a huge impact on the future growth of the collection. And also I think this Sex and Sexuality product that Adam, Matthew, and Kinsey worked together, I think it really will excite and inspire donors who are collectors and scholars, researchers, or ordinary citizens, and they can imagine how their own records can be part of a collective voice. And I think then they will believe that the collective voice will better inform and you know, better understand human conditions and human sexuality. I think this really means a great deal to scholars and donors and general public as well.
Excellent. This is Mark from ACRL and Choice. As has been mentioned, we are moving into the Q&A portion of today's discussion. So I would just encourage everybody out there, if you do have questions for any of our panelists, please drop them in the Q&A box. We've got a few minutes here to field some questions. So one that we do have in the hopper already that came through is what sorts of other topics are people discussing in the letters that were sent to Kinsey and that are included in Sex and Sexuality? So I would ask maybe Liana or Shawn, do you want to field that one? What other sorts of topics are in the letters?
The other general public sort of letters, or the letters that we refer to as the Dear Dr. Kinsey letters, are very varied, obviously. People wrote in for many reasons, seeking advice, asking simple questions. You know, am I normal? Is this a normal activity? What are other people doing? But there's also professional correspondence, which is a huge part of the collection. Also, Kinsey corresponded with lots of other researchers and administrators, as well as collectors when he was trying to build the Institute Library. He also was requested to give talks. All of that correspondence is included.
That's excellent list of the literature of inquiries. So Kinsey has a lot of media, caused a lot of media interest. So I think many of the correspondence would be Kinsey with some of the newspapers, magazine, and TV. So there's a lot of, we have a collection of over 18,000 media reporting of Kinsey, the review of Kinsey reports, inviting Kinsey to be on Today's Show, for example. So there's a wide range of engagement and interaction with all sectors of the society, from schools, hospitals, musicians association, police academy. So just a very, very broad perspective of Kinsey's engagement with the society in general, and also international as well, international audience.
Excellent. Wow, that is astoundingly broad. I would just ask, do you have anything that you would add to that, Paul, about the letters?
Yeah, and I'm terribly sorry. I can't figure out how to turn off the phone response thing on my computer, so I apologize that my phone has now rung twice in this meeting. I think one of the things that's very interesting is the way in which the Kinsey correspondence and the Gebhardt correspondence reveal the kind of vast intellectual network that is emerging around matters of sexuality in the middle part of the century, because they weren't, in fact, operating in isolation. They were very much part of this kind of larger international community of people working in the field of sexology broadly. And one of the things that struck me was just that range of correspondence. And also the ways in which, for example, you have correspondence around funding matters, which is also an important part of the narrative in the Kinsey Institute, is sort of thinking about how Kinsey is getting money for his research. And I thought that was really intriguing. Of course, the most compelling letters are, in fact, the ones in which people deal with personal issues and talk. I think the ones that are most sort of striking are the ones where people, as Shawn notes, ask about whether behaviors that they are engaging in are normal, whether emotions that they have are normal, and also some of the profound sadness that and really the depression that accompanies many of these letters as people kind of reflect on their lives, and particularly the sense of isolation that some people feel matters of sexuality.
Yeah, that sounds like it could be incredibly moving to read some of those letters. Absolutely. We've got a question here from John, who poses what I think is a pretty interesting question. He says, if an institution or individual scholar should breach a source's anonymity, or for whatever reason, how should the responsible party go about correcting the mistake without drawing more attention to the breach and causing more damage to the affected subject? Shawn, Liana, have you ever had to deal with something like that, or do you have a set of procedures for dealing with a situation like that?
That is a very good question. I think if that came to our attention, I think usually to understand the nature of the problem and what is the impact. And I think there are always ways of correcting. I think acknowledgement of oversight or mistake on the researchers or collection staff's part. I think that is the first step. I think it depends on the nature of the problem. I think there can be a set of corrective measures in place. And I think both Shawn and I are thinking very hard and see if we can have an example to respond to that. We cannot think of any because we have been very, very careful when our scholars come to use our collection. I think in general, they have some understanding, and I think after knowing the literature and really impress upon them the importance, so I think they are oftentimes considering what's best for the field, what's best for the study. So not really creating a problem for the discipline or so it's not only their individual reputation, but also reputation and integrity for the field of study.
Excellent. Do you have anything that you would add to that, Shawn?
No, I agree.
No, and if not, yeah, that's totally fine. Just thought. What about you, Paul? Do you have anything that you would add to?
Yeah, I think this is a very difficult issue, and in fact, there's a lot of discussion among scholars, as I alluded to in my presentation, about the importance of preserving anonymity. And of course, I think one of the things that emerges is, as scholars, as ethical scholars, we must abide by the rules and regulations of institutes like the Kinsey Institute, right? So if the expectation is that we will preserve anonymity, then we should preserve anonymity as a condition of being able to use that material. So I think that that's really important to honor the both the request of the person who might have donated the materials or the experiences, but also to honor the ethical obligations of the organization or the archive. There's a really interesting work. There was a 2001 book by a sociologist, anthropologist named Arlene Stein, in which she talks about responses in one Oregon community to a ballot initiative on lesbian and gay rights. And when the book was published, it was fairly easy for members of that community to identify the name of the town and the respondents. And this kind of prompted a really interesting discussion about kind of matters of anonymity, which she reflects on in a 2010 article, in which she sort of describes the conundrum of being placed in this position. Even though she did all that she could to try to preserve anonymity, people in that community were able to find things out and to sort of pass allegations around the community. And it's a really interesting insight into the kind of on-the-ground implications of scholarship in some instances. And I think that's just a good reminder of the way in which this is a fraught sort of topic. I do think that things occasionally do get revealed somewhat unintentionally. And sometimes it's probably best to not mention too much about it. But I think, my experience as a historian is that my historian colleagues are really careful to preserve the anonymity of subjects if that's an expectation of the archive that they're working with.
Excellent, excellent. All right, we are coming up to the end of our time today. So I would just like to take a moment to say thank you to you, Rebecca, and Liana, and Shawn, and Paul for taking some time to talk with us about this really some interesting stuff. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark and Rebecca.
everybody.
Thanks.
And just the last thing for those of you out there listening in today, please do take a moment to respond to the survey link that was dropped into the chat box there. It's very brief, and we really appreciate any responses that we get to that. It definitely helps to shape the webinar program and provide feedback. So if you have a moment to do that, please do respond to the survey there. And I would just also remind folks that we did record the program, so be on the lookout for that follow-up email with a link to the recording, probably sometime tomorrow morning. Thanks to everybody out there for listening in. I hope you enjoyed the session, and I hope the rest of your day is great.
Thanks, Mark.